The sun hung low over the Nevada territory, painting the endless expanse of sagebrush and sand in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson. It was the summer of 1882, and the small town of Bitter Creek sat like a forgotten prayer in the middle of nowhere. Surrounded by parched grasslands that stretched to the distant mountains, those mountains, blue-gray sentinels against the horizon, held secrets and dangers that most townfolk preferred not to think about. Margaret Ellen Shaw stood at the edge of town, her calloused hands gripping the handle of a water bucket. At 23, she had already lived more hardship than most women twice her age. Her pale blue dress, faded from too many washings and mended in more places than she could count, hung loosely on her thin frame. The desert wind tugged at strands of auburn hair that had escaped from her simple bun. But she didn't bother to fix them. There was no one to look pretty for, and hadn't been for as long as she could remember. She had come to Bitter Creek 5 years ago, after her parents died of fever on the wagon trail. With no family and no prospects, she'd taken work wherever she could find it, washing clothes for the miners, mending shirts for the cowboys, cleaning rooms at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. It was honest work, but it was lonely work. The other women in town looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. An unmarried woman with no family was an oddity, almost a curse in a place where everyone belonged to someone. Margaret filled her bucket from the communal well, her movements mechanical from years of repetition. Around her, Bitter Creek went about its evening routines. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, their heads low in the heat. The saloon's piano tinkled faintly, a melody that spoke of faraway places and lost dreams. Miners trudged past, their faces dark with dust and exhaustion, heading for whatever comfort a shot of whiskey might provide. "Evening, Miss Shaw," called out Tom Garrett, the blacksmith's son. He was a decent enough young man, with broad shoulders and an honest face, but Margaret felt nothing when she looked at him. She nodded politely and continued on her way. Tom had tried courting her once, bringing her wildflowers picked from the hillside, but she gently refused. How could she explain that her heart felt as dry as the desert soil, that she'd never known what it meant to truly want someone? The boarding house where she lived and worked stood at the far end of the main street, a 2-story building that had seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls like old skin, and the porch sagged under the weight of too many years. Mrs. Henderson, a widow herself, ran the place with an iron fist and a sharp tongue. She was waiting on the porch when Margaret returned. "About time," the older woman said, her gray eyes narrowing. "The new guests will be wanting their wash water. And mind you, check the locks tonight. There's been talk." "Talk?" Margaret set down the bucket, her arms aching. "Apache," Mrs. Henderson said, lowering her voice. "Clem Rodriguez came in from his ranch today. Said he saw signs of them moving through the valley. Probably nothing, but you can't be too careful with those savages." Margaret had heard such talk before. The Apache were like ghosts in these parts, sometimes seen, often feared, always blamed when cattle went missing or a wagon was found abandoned. She'd never seen one herself, but the stories were enough to make anyone uneasy. Tales of attacks, of settlers found dead, of women carried off into the mountains, never to return. That night, as she went about her chores, Margaret found herself glancing out the windows more often than usual. The boarding house felt smaller somehow, its thin walls a poor defense against whatever might lurk in the darkness. She served dinner to the guests, a traveling merchant and 2 surveyors heading west, and listened to their talk of railroad expansion and mining claims. Their words washed over her like distant thunder, meaningful to them, but empty to her. After the dishes were done and the guests had retired, Margaret stood on the back porch, looking out at the desert. The moon had risen, casting everything in silver and shadow. Somewhere out there, coyotes yipped and howled, their voices carrying on the still air. The mountains loomed dark against the stars, holding their secrets close. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Though the night was warm, This was her life. Work, sleep, work again. No husband, no children, no love to warm her bed or her heart. Sometimes she wondered if she was even capable of love, or if that part of her had died with her parents on the trail. She'd watched other women with their husbands, seen the light in their eyes, the secret smiles, the gentle touches. It all seemed as foreign to her as the moon itself.
"Lord,"
she whispered to the darkness.
"is this all there is?"
The desert gave no answer, only the endless whisper of wind through sage. The next morning brought news that set the town buzzing. A supply wagon headed for the mining camp had been found overturned and ransacked, its drivers missing. Sheriff Watson rode out with a posse to investigate, and when they returned, their faces were grim. Apache sign all around. The sheriff announced to the crowd gathered outside his office, "Fresh tracks heading north into the mountains. I've sent word to Fort Buchanan for army support." Fear rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Women clutched their children closer, and men checked their rifles. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, feeling the familiar weight of being alone. If trouble came, who would protect her? She had only herself, as always. That afternoon, as she beat dust from carpets behind the boarding house, she heard horses approaching fast. Riders came tearing into town, shouting about smoke signals in the hills. The fear that had been simmering now boiled over. People ran for their homes. Slamming shutters closed. The saloon emptied as men grabbed their guns. Margaret watched it all with a strange detachment. Part of her was afraid, yes, but another part felt oddly excited. This was something different, something that broke the endless monotony of her days. She knew she should feel guilty for such thoughts, but she couldn't help it. Even danger was preferable to the gray emptiness of her existence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she stood at her window looking out at the mountains. Somewhere up there, people lived a different life, wild, free, dangerous perhaps, but alive in a way she'd never been. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and wondered what it would be like to run towards something instead of simply enduring. "Mrs." Henderson's sharp voice broke her reverie. "Margaret, stop your dreaming and help me bar these doors. Lord knows what this night might bring." Margaret turned away from the window, but the image of those distant mountains stayed with her. She helped secure the boarding house, checked on the nervous guests, and prepared for a long night. But even as she went through the motions, her mind wandered to places she'd never been, to a life she'd never lived. Outside, the desert waited, vast and patient. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from distant storms, and in the mountains, fires burned, Apache fires, some said, though no one knew for certain. Margaret lay in her narrow bed, listening to the house creak and settle, and felt something stir in her chest. It wasn't quite hope, wasn't quite fear. It was more like awakening, the first crack in a shell that had held her for too long. She had never loved any man, never felt that pull that other women spoke of in whispers, but lying there in the darkness, with danger prowling the edges of her small world, she wondered if perhaps she'd simply been waiting for something her quiet life could never provide, something wild, something that would crack her open and let her truly feel. The night passed without incident, but the feeling remained. Change was coming to Bitter Creek, riding on desert wind and painted in shadow, and Margaret Ellen Shaw, who had never loved, who had never truly lived, found herself waiting for it with a heart that beat faster than it had in years. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. The town remained on edge, with men standing guard in shifts and women keeping their children close. Margaret went about her duties at the boarding house, but the tension was palpable. Even the simplest tasks felt weighted with anticipation, as if the very air was holding its breath. It was late afternoon when she set out for the general store, needing supplies for the evening meal. The sun blazed overhead, turning the dusty street into a ribbon of gold. She'd taken the wagon, as Mrs., Henderson needed more provisions than she could carry. The old mare, Buttercup, plodded along slowly, seeming to sense the unease that gripped the town. Margaret had just loaded the last sack of flour when she heard it. The thunder of hooves, the crack of gunfire, the screams. Her blood turned to ice as masked riders burst into town from the east, their guns blazing. They wore Apache clothing, but something was wrong. Their movements were too familiar, their shouts in English rather than Apache tongue. "The bank!" someone yelled. "They're robbing the bank!" Chaos erupted. People scattered like leaves before a storm. Margaret froze beside the wagon, her hands gripping the wooden side. The riders, 6 of them, were shooting into the air, creating panic. One of them spotted her and spurred his horse in her direction. "Well, well," he called out, his voice muffled by a bandana. "What have we here?" Margaret's heart hammered as she recognized the voice. Jake Morrison, a drifter who'd been run out of town months ago for cheating at cards. These weren't Apache at all, but white men dressed as them, using fear as their weapon. She tried to run, but Jake was faster. He leaned down from his saddle, reaching for her. His fingers caught her arm, yanking her off balance. She stumbled, crying out as she fell against the wagon wheel. Gunfire crackled around them. Someone screamed, whether in fear or pain. She couldn't tell. Then, cutting through the chaos like a knife through cloth, came a sound that made everyone freeze, a war cry, high and fierce, from the hills above town. Real Apache. A lone rider burst onto the main street, moving with a grace that made Jake's gang look like clumsy children. This warrior wore no mask, no disguise. His face was painted with traditional markings, his long black hair streaming behind him. He carried a rifle, but it was his presence that commanded attention, fierce, proud, dangerous. Jake's hand loosened on Margaret's arm as he turned to face this new threat. The Apache warrior's dark eyes swept the scene, taking in the fake clothing, the robbery in progress, the terrorized townspeople. His gaze lingered on Margaret for a heartbeat, noting her position on the ground, Jake's grip on her arm. What happened next was almost too fast to follow. The warrior raised his rifle and fired. Jake cursed and released Margaret, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. The Apache wheeled his horse, charging directly at the group of imposters. His war cry rang out again, and this time it was answered from the hills. More Apache were coming. The fake raiders panicked. Their leaders shouted for retreat, and they scattered, abandoning their bank robbery in favor of escape. Jake tried to remount his horse, but the animal, spooked by the war cries, bucked and ran. He stumbled toward Margaret again, whether for hostage or revenge. She didn't know. The Apache warrior was there in an instant. He leaped from his horse with cat-like grace, placing himself between Margaret and Jake. Up close, she could see he was young, perhaps only a few years older than herself. His face was angular and strong, with high cheekbones and eyes like obsidian. Those eyes held Jake's, promising violence if he came closer. Jake went for his gun. The Apache moved faster, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. The blade whistled through the air, knocking the pistol from Jake's grip. Jake stumbled backward, his face pale beneath the bandana.
"This ain't your fight, savage,"
Jake snarled, trying to sound brave. The Apache said nothing, but his stance spoke volumes. Behind him, Margaret struggled to her feet, her legs shaking. She could run, should run, but something kept her there. This warrior had saved her, placed himself in danger for her. Why? More shots rang out as the rest of Jake's gang tried to flee and found themselves facing real Apache warriors. The imposters were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and thoroughly outmatched. Within minutes, they were in full retreat, racing for the desert with Apache riders in pursuit. The warrior in front of Margaret relaxed slightly, though his eyes never left Jake. The wounded outlaw backed away, then turned and ran, following his fleeing companions. Only then did the Apache turn to face Margaret. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to stop. She should have been terrified. Here was one of the feared Apache, standing close enough to touch, his knife still in his hand. But she felt no fear. Instead, she felt recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting for this moment. He said something in his language, his voice deep and melodious. When she shook her head, not understanding, he frowned slightly. Then, to her amazement, he spoke in accented but clear English. "You are hurt." She glanced down at her arm, seeing for the first time the bruises forming where Jake had grabbed her.
No, I'm fine.
He studied her for a long moment, and she found herself studying him in return. This close, she could see that his war paint didn't completely hide a face that was both fierce and somehow gentle. His eyes held depth she couldn't fathom, stories she couldn't read. The sound of approaching voices broke the spell. Townspeople were emerging from hiding, and she could hear Sheriff Watson shouting orders. The Apache warrior stepped back, moving toward his horse with fluid grace. But before he mounted, he looked back at her one more time. "Be careful," he said. "Bad men wear many faces." Then he was gone, vaulting onto his horse and riding hard for the hills. Margaret stood frozen, watching him disappear, her heart beating a rhythm she'd never felt before. "Margaret, good Lord. Girl, are you hurt?" Mrs. Henderson came huffing up, her face flushed with fear and exertion. "Did that savage touch you? Did he?"
He saved me,
Margaret interrupted, her voice distant. "Jake Morrison was going to, and he saved me." "Mrs." Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Around them, the town erupted in confusion. Some men wanted to pursue the Apache, convinced they were part of the attack. Others, who had seen more clearly, argued that the Apache had driven off the real attackers. "Them weren't no Apache robbing the bank," declared Samuel Forbes, the banker. "I saw Jake Morrison's ugly face clear as day. They was white men dressed up, trying to pin it on the Indians." Sheriff Watson looked grimmer than ever. "And now we got real Apache involved. This is going to bring the army down on all of us." Margaret barely heard the arguments swirling around her. She helped Mrs. Henderson gather the scattered supplies, her movements automatic, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment when the warrior's eyes had met hers. She'd lived her whole life feeling nothing, and then, in one instant, everything had changed. It was as if lightning had struck her, awakening something that had been sleeping. That night, as the town buzzed with talk of the day's events, Margaret stood at her window again. The mountains were dark shapes against the stars, holding new meaning now. Somewhere out there, he was riding through the night. Did he think of her? Did he feel the same strange pull she did? Foolishness, she whispered to herself. He was Apache. She was white. Their worlds were meant to be separate, hostile to each other. And yet, she pressed her fingers to her bruised arm, remembering not Jake's cruel grip but the warrior's protective stance. He could have ignored her, let Jake take her. His fight wasn't with the town, but he'd intervened, risked himself for a stranger. No, not a stranger. In that moment when their eyes met, she'd felt known in a way she never had before. It made no sense, defied all logic, but her heart didn't care about logic. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in her narrow bed, reliving every second of the encounter, the way he'd moved, like wind given form, the sound of his voice, speaking English with an accent that made the words seem new, the concern in his eyes when he'd asked if she was hurt. She'd never loved any man, never felt the pull other women described. But now, after just moments in his presence, she understood. This was what she'd been waiting for without knowing it. This was why her heart had stayed locked away. It had been waiting for him. The thought terrified her. It thrilled her. It changed everything and nothing all at once. She was still Margaret Ellen Shaw. Orphan, servant, nobody special. But now she was also Margaret, who had been saved by an Apache warrior. Margaret, who had looked into dark eyes and seen her own soul reflected back. As dawn crept over the mountains, painting them rose and gold, she made a decision. She didn't know what would come of it, didn't know if she'd ever see him again. But she would not forget. She would not let fear or prejudice diminish what had happened. She had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms. He hadn't literally embraced her, but in that moment of protection, of connection, she'd felt held in a way that went beyond the physical. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Ellen Shaw wanted something more than mere survival. She wanted to see him again. She wanted to know his name. She wanted to understand this fire he'd lit in her chest that burned brighter than the desert sun. The days that followed were the hardest Margaret had ever endured. Not because of the work. She was used to that. Not because of the fear that still gripped the town. She'd known fear before. No. These days were hard because she felt as if she'd been split in two. Her body went through the motions of daily life, but her spirit was elsewhere, wandering the mountains, searching for a glimpse of a painted face and dark eyes. The town's reaction was swift and merciless. Word of her defense of the Apache warrior spread like wildfire. She hadn't said much, just that he'd saved her from Jake Morrison. But in the minds of the townspeople, that was enough to damn her.
Bewitched,
she heard Mrs. Pritchard whisper to her companions outside the church. That's what happens when them savages get their hands on a decent woman. They put a spell on her. Always was odd. That Margaret Shaw, another woman replied, living alone, refusing good Christian suitors. Now we know why. Bad blood attracts bad blood. Margaret kept her head high as she walked past them, though their words stung. She'd grown used to being an outsider, but this was different. Before, she'd been pitied. Now, she was suspected, even feared. Mrs. Henderson was the worst of all. The older woman watched Margaret like a hawk, suspicious of every glance toward the window, every moment of distraction.
"You'll bring ruin on us all,"
she hissed one evening as Margaret served dinner to the boarders.
"Them Apache will come for you. Mark my words.
They'll burn this whole town to get their hands on a white woman who's shown them favor."
"He saved my life,"
Margaret said quietly, setting down a plate with more force than necessary.
"Would you rather Jake Morrison had—" "I'd rather you'd had the sense to scream for help from decent folk,
Mrs. Henderson's face was red with indignation.
"Not stand there making eyes at a savage."
Margaret fled to the kitchen, her hands shaking. Making eyes, is that what they thought that she'd wanted? She pressed her palms against the rough counter, trying to steady herself. The truth was worse than their accusations. She hadn't made eyes at him then, but she'd done nothing but think of him since. Late at night, when the boarding house was quiet, she stood at her window and gazed at the mountains. They seemed to call to her now, those dark peaks where he'd vanished. She found herself creating stories about him. What was his name? Did he have family? What had brought him to town that day? Sometimes she imagined she saw movement in the hills, a rider on a distant ridge, a flash of movement among the rocks. Her heart would leap, and she'd press closer to the glass, straining to see, but it was always nothing, just shadows and wishful thinking. Tom Garrett tried to court her again, more insistently this time. "You need protection, Margaret," he said, cornering her outside the general store. "A woman alone, with all this Indian trouble. I could take care of you." "I don't need taking care of," she replied, trying to step around him. He caught her arm, gentle but firm. "People are talking, saying ugly things. If you were married, had a respectable husband, they'd stop." She looked at his earnest face, his pleading eyes. He was a good man. She knew that. Safe, predictable. Everything a woman in her position should want. But when she tried to imagine accepting his proposal, her mind filled with images of a different face, a different pair of eyes. "I'm sorry, Tom," she said softly. "I can't." His expression hardened. It's because of him. Isn't it that Apache? You've gone and lost your mind over a savage who'd as soon scalp you as look at you. You don't know him, she said before she could stop herself.
And you do?
Tom's voice rose.
1 minute of him playing hero, and you think you know him. Wake up. Margaret, whatever fantasy you've built in your head, it's going to get you killed.
She pulled free and walked away, but his words followed her. Was he right? Was she building fantasies around a man she'd barely met, but every time she tried to dismiss what had happened, she remembered the connection she'd felt, electric and undeniable. The tension in town grew worse when Army patrols began arriving from Fort Buchanan. Soldiers in dusty blue uniforms rode through, their eyes scanning the hills. Captain Abraham Foster set up a temporary command post in the sheriff's office. He was a hard man with sun-weathered skin and cold gray eyes.
We'll root out these Apache once and for all,
he declared to a gathering in the town square.
They've broken the treaty by coming this close to settled lands.
Any Apache found within 20 miles will be considered hostile. Margaret's heart sank. 20 miles included all the nearby mountains, all the places he might be. She wanted to speak up, to explain that the Apache had helped, not harmed. But she saw the looks people gave her and held her tongue. Her word would only make things worse. That night, she made a decision that she knew was foolish. She waited until the boarding house was asleep, then slipped out the back door. The moon was just a sliver, providing little light, but she knew the path. She'd walked it in her mind 100 times. She headed toward the hills, toward the place where he'd vanished that day. Her heart hammered with each step. This was madness. She could be killed by Apache who didn't know her, by soldiers who'd shoot first and ask questions later, by wild animals, or simply by losing her way in the dark. But she couldn't stay away any longer. The need to see him again, to know if what she'd felt was real, drove her forward. She climbed the first rise, her dress catching on sage and scrub. The town fell away behind her, its few lights like fallen stars. At the top of the ridge, she stopped, suddenly aware of how foolish she was being. What did she expect? That he'd be waiting for her, that he'd even remember her? She was about to turn back when she heard it, the soft nicker of a horse. She froze. A figure emerged from the shadows, leading a paint horse. Her breath caught. It was him, even in the darkness. She knew his silhouette, the way he moved. He stopped a few feet away, and she could feel his surprise. "You should not be here," he said in that same accented English. "I know," she whispered. I had to." He moved closer, and moonlight caught his face. He wasn't wearing war paint now, and she could see his features more clearly. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with the soft prettiness of town men. His face was all angles and strength, weathered by sun and wind. "Why?" he asked simply. How could she explain that she'd been dead inside until he appeared? That saving her life had somehow given her life, that she'd never believed in fate until fate rode into town on a paint horse. "You saved me," she said finally. "I wanted to thank you." His eyes studied her in the darkness. "You thanked me, in town, when you spoke truth about the white men who wore our clothes. They didn't believe me." "No, they never do." There was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance of fact. "Your people see what they expect to see." "They're not my people," she said, surprised by her own vehemence. "I don't have people." Something shifted in his expression. He came closer still, and she caught his scent, leather and smoke and something wild. "Everyone has people." "Not me. My parents died. I'm alone." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I know this feeling." The words were simple, but they held weight. She wanted to ask more, but he was already stepping back. "You must go. Soldiers are everywhere. If they find you here." "What's your name?" she asked desperately. He hesitated. Names had power, she knew. To give a name was to give trust. "Naiche," he said finally. "I am called Naiche." "Naiche," she repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables.
I'm Margaret.
Margaret. He said it slowly, as if committing it to memory. Go now, Margaret. Do not come to the hills again. It is not safe.
Will I see you again?
He didn't answer, already melting back into the shadows. But just before he disappeared, he turned back. Be careful. Your people, they will not understand. Then he was gone, and she was alone on the ridge. She made her way back to town, her mind reeling. She'd seen him, spoken to him, learned his name. It should have been enough. It should have satisfied whatever madness had driven her into the hills. Instead, it only made the longing worse. Now she had a name to whisper in the darkness. Naichi. Now she had more memories to torture herself with. His scent, the way he'd said her name, the pain in his voice when he spoke of being alone. She slipped back into the boarding house just before dawn, muddy and exhausted. Mrs. Henderson was waiting in the kitchen, her face like thunder. "Where have you been?" the older woman demanded. Margaret lifted her chin.
Walking. I couldn't sleep.
Walking, at night, in the hills. Mrs. Henderson's voice was flat. You went looking for him. There was no point in denying it. Yes. Pack your things. You're no longer welcome here. I won't have Apache lovers under my roof, bringing danger to decent folk. Margaret felt the words like a physical blow, but she kept her face calm. I'll be gone within the hour. She gathered her few possessions, 2 dresses, a shawl, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents. Everything she owned fit in one small carpet bag. She left the boarding house as the sun rose, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. But as she stood in the street, homeless and friendless, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. She was free now, free from Mrs. Henderson's disapproval, free from the town's expectations. She'd lost what little security she had, but she'd gained something else. She'd gained the memory of Naichi saying her name in the darkness. She'd gained the knowledge that somewhere in those hills was a man who understood loneliness as she did. She'd gained the terrible, wonderful certainty that she'd rather be cast out for following her heart than safe in a life that wasn't living at all. She had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms. He hadn't touched her, not physically, but in speaking her name, in sharing that moment of understanding. He'd embraced her soul, and she knew, with a certainty that should have frightened her but didn't, that she would see him again, no matter what it cost her. Margaret found shelter in an abandoned shack at the edge of town, a place that had once housed miners before the silver vein ran dry. The roof leaked and the walls were little more than weathered planks, but it was better than sleeping in the open. She spent her days taking in washing from the few who would still hire her, earning barely enough for food. 2 weeks passed in this manner. The army patrols increased, riding out each dawn and returning at dusk, always empty-handed. The Apache had vanished like smoke, but their presence was felt in every shadow, every unexplained sound. Margaret watched the soldiers and worried, wondering if Naichi was safe, if he was far away or still hidden in the hills she could see from her doorway. Then came the day the sandstorm struck. She'd gone to the creek for water, traveling further than usual because the drought had reduced the flow to a trickle. The sky had been clear when she left, but desert weather was treacherous. She first noticed the change in the wind-hot gusts that picked up dust and sent tumbleweeds racing across the landscape. Then she saw it, a wall of brown rising from the horizon, eating the world as it came. Margaret had lived in the desert long enough to know the danger. Sandstorms could blind you, choke you, bury you alive if you were caught exposed. She was too far from town, too far from her shack. The creek bed offered little shelter, just some scraggly cottonwoods and shallow banks. She tried to run, but the storm was faster. It hit her like a physical force, sand scouring her skin, filling her nose and mouth. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. She stumbled, fell, tried to cover her face with her shawl. The world became a howling brown nightmare. Then, through the chaos, she felt strong hands grasp her shoulders. Someone pulled her upright, wrapped something around her face. An arm circled her waist, guiding her forward. She couldn't see who it was, but she knew. Even in the storm, she recognized his touch. Naichi half carried, half dragged her through the tempest. She had no idea where they were going, trusting blindly as he led her up what felt like a steep slope. Her feet slipped on loose rocks, but he never let her fall. Finally, blessedly, the howling diminished. They were in some kind of shelter. She pulled the cloth from her face, gasping and coughing. They were in a shallow cave, really just an overhang of rock, but it blocked the worst of the storm. Naichi was beside her, his own face covered, his dark eyes watching her with concern. "Breathe slowly," he said, handing her a water skin. "Small sips." She obeyed, the cool water washing sand from her throat. Outside, the storm raged, turning day to twilight. In the cave, they were pressed close together, and she was acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand steadying her back, his shoulder against hers. "How did you find me?" she asked when she could speak. "I watch," he said simply. "Since you came to the hills, I watched to keep you safe." Her heart stuttered. "You've been watching me." He looked away, something almost like embarrassment crossing his features. "The town is angry. Soldiers hunt my people. I think maybe they hurt you because of what happened. So I watch." The idea that he'd been out there, protecting her without her knowledge, sent warmth flooding through her chest. "Naichi, you should not have left the town alone." He interrupted. "Storm season is here. Very dangerous." "I had no choice. I need water to wash clothes, to earn money." She hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Henderson threw me out. Because I went to find you that night." His jaw tightened. "This is my fault." "No." She turned to face him fully, her hand finding his arm. "No, it's not. I made my choice. I'd make it again." He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. "Why? Why do you not fear me like the others?" How could she explain that from the moment their eyes met? She'd felt safe with him in a way she'd never felt with anyone. That her heart, so long dormant, had chosen him without consulting her mind. "You saved me," she said twice now. "That is not answer," he said softly. "Your people save each other. They still fear us." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside. In here, in this small space, the world felt far away. There was only the two of them, only this moment. "When I was 15, she said slowly, "I watched my parents die. Fever took them on the trail. I held their hands, nursed them, buried them. And then I was alone. For 8 years, I have been alone. Not just without family, but empty. Like part of me died with them." She took a shaky breath. "Then you rode into town, and when you looked at me, I felt alive again. For the first time in 8 years. I felt something. I don't understand it, but I can't pretend it didn't happen." Naichi was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "My wife died 3 winters ago. She and our son. Sickness the white man brought. After that, I'm also empty. I fight because fighting is all I have left, until, she prompted gently. "Until I see you by the wagon, see the fear in your eyes, but also strength. You do not cry, do not beg. You stand straight even when afraid, and I remember what it is to want to protect something, to feel something besides anger." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. They were two broken people, brought together by violence, but bound by something deeper, the recognition of shared pain, shared emptiness, and the possibility of healing. The storm howled on, and time seemed to stretch. They talked, sharing stories in the dim light. She learned that his name meant mischievous one, given because as a child he was always getting into trouble. He learned that she loved to read but had only one book, her mother's Bible, which she'd read so many times she had it memorized. He told her about his people's ways, how they moved with the seasons, following game and water, how they knew every plant, every animal track, every sign the desert offered. She told him about life in the town, the petty cruelties and small kindnesses, the way loneliness could exist even in a crowd. "Your English is very good," she said at one point. "How did you learn?" His expression darkened slightly. "Mission school. When I was boy, they take us from families, try to make us white, cut our hair, forbid our language, beat us when we speak Apache." He touched his hair, now long again. "I run away, go back to my people, but the words stay." She heard the pain beneath the matter-of-fact tone and reached for his hand. He let her take it, his fingers curling around hers. They sat that way, hands clasped. As the storm gradually began to weaken, "What will happen to us?" she asked quietly. "My people hate yours. Your people have reason to hate mine. How can we—" "I do not know," he admitted. "I know only that when I am with you, the empty feeling goes away. Is that not enough for now?" She squeezed his hand. "It's everything." The storm was dying. The howling wind reduced to gusts. Soon she would have to leave, go back to her leaking shack and her precarious existence. He would have to return to the hills, to stay ahead of the soldiers. But for now, they had this, a cave, a storm, and the first real connection either had felt in years. "Margaret," he said, her name still careful on his tongue. "I cannot come to town, cannot court you as white man would, cannot give you safe life." "I don't want a safe life," she said. "I had safe. Safe is empty. Safe is dead inside." He turned to her fully then, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "You are very brave or very foolish." "Both," she admitted with a shaky laugh. "Definitely both." He smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face. Gone was the fierce warrior, replaced by a man who looked younger, lighter, as if he too was remembering what it felt like to be happy. The storm had passed. Weak sunlight filtered into the cave. They both knew their time was up, but neither moved to leave just yet. "I will find way to see you again," he promised, "when it is safer." "How will I know?" He thought for a moment, then pointed to a distinctive rock formation visible from the cave entrance. "You see those 3 rocks, like fingers pointing at sky? When I can come safely, I will leave sign there, white stone on top of middle rock. Check each day at sunset." She memorized the formation, hope blooming in her chest. "And if I need you, if there's danger, make fire at night, small fire, with green wood to make smoke. I will see." They made their way down from the cave, the world washed clean by the storm. At the bottom of the hill, they had to part. She toward town, he toward the mountains. But before they separated, he caught her hand once more. "That day in town," he said, "when I stand between you and the bad man, you asked why." He met her eyes. "Now you know. The empty feeling, it went away when I saw you. I do not understand, but I know it is true." Then he was gone, vanishing into the landscape with the skill of his people. Margaret made her way back to town, covered in dust but with a heart that sang. She'd found him again, talked with him, held his hand, and he'd promised to find a way to see her. She had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms. Today he had literally pulled her to safety, held her through the storm. And in that cave, with the world raging outside, she'd found what she'd never thought to have, someone who understood her loneliness, her emptiness, and filled it with his presence. Whatever came next, whatever price she had to pay, it would be worth it for moments like these. The white stone appeared on the 3rd night after the storm. Margaret's heart leaped when she spotted it at sunset, a pale beacon against the red rock. She waited until full darkness fell, then slipped away from her shack, moving carefully through the shadows. The town was quiet, most folks already in their homes. But she couldn't be too careful. Captain Foster had imposed a curfew, and soldiers patrolled the streets. She found Naichi waiting in a grove of mesquite trees near the creek, his horse grazing quietly nearby. When she appeared, he stepped forward, and without thinking, she went into his arms. It felt as natural as breathing, as if she'd been embracing him all her life. He held her for a long moment, his chin resting on top of her head. "I was afraid you wouldn't see the stone," he murmured.
"I check every sunset,"
she admitted, pulling back to look at him. "I've worn a path in the dust." He smiled at that, the expression softening his features. "Come, I want to show you something." He helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him. She'd never ridden like this, pressed against a man's chest, surrounded by his warmth. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and she felt safer than she ever had in her life. They rode in silence through the darkness, following paths she couldn't see but he knew by heart. The desert night was alive with sounds, coyotes calling, owls hunting, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. Stars blazed overhead, so bright they cast shadows. After perhaps an hour, they climbed into higher country. Pine trees appeared, their scent sharp and clean. The air grew cooler. Finally, Naichi stopped in a small meadow where a spring bubbled from the rocks, creating a pool of crystal clear water. "This is sacred place for my people," he said, helping her down. "Place of peace. No fighting here, ever. Even enemies can drink together at this spring." Margaret looked around in wonder. The meadow was like something from a dream, untouched by the harsh realities of the world below. Flowers she'd never seen before grew near the water, their petals luminous in the starlight. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "like paradise." "My wife loved this place," Naichi said quietly. "I bring you here because I want you to know who I am. Not just warrior, not just Apache who saved you, but man who has sacred places, who has memories, who has heart that was dead but now beats again." They sat by the spring, and he began to teach her. Not just words in his language, though he taught her those too, but ways of seeing. He showed her how to read the night sounds, to know which birds called warnings and which sang for joy. He taught her the names of plants, which ones healed and which ones harmed. He spoke of his people's history, their connection to this land that went back countless generations. "Your people say we are savage," he said at one point, "but we live in harmony with Earth. Take only what we need. Give thanks for what we take." Who is savage? The one who lives with land or one who destroys it? Margaret thought of the mines scarring the mountains, the streams muddied by waste, the buffalo bones scattered across the plains. I think my people are afraid of what they don't understand, so they destroy it." "Are you afraid?" he asked, his dark eyes serious. "No," she said without hesitation. "Not of you, never of you." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. "What are you afraid of?" "Losing this," she admitted. "Losing you. Going back to being empty." "You will not lose me," he said firmly. "Even if we cannot be together, you are in here now." He placed his hand over his heart. "Cannot lose what lives inside." They met this way for weeks, always in different places, always careful. He showed her hidden canyons painted with ancient symbols, caves where his ancestors had sheltered, overlooks where the whole world seemed to spread below them. She told him stories from books she'd read, described places she'd never seen but dreamed of, oceans and forests and cities with buildings that touched the sky. With each meeting, their bond deepened. They created their own language, part English, part Apache, part simply understanding without words. He taught her to move silently through the brush, to find water in the desert, to read weather in the flight of birds. She taught him to write his name, to read simple words, to see the music in poetry. One night, as they sat on a ridge overlooking the valley. He gave her a gift, a small leather pouch on a cord.
What is it?
She asked, opening it carefully. Protection, he said. Sacred things. Turquoise for healing, eagle feather for courage, white shell for pure heart. Wear it always. She slipped it around her neck, the pouch resting against her heart. I have nothing to give you. You give me yourself, he said simply, is more than enough. But their happiness couldn't last. The world below was growing more dangerous. The army had reinforced, bringing more soldiers, Apache scouts who could track their own people. There had been skirmishes to the south, reports of raids and reprisals. The fragile peace was breaking down. One night, Nietzsche was late to their meeting place. Margaret waited, anxiety growing with each passing minute. When he finally appeared, she could see something was wrong. His face was grim, his movements tense.
What is it?
She asked, gripping his hands. My people move north, he said. Too many soldiers here. Too dangerous. The chiefs say we must go. Her heart dropped.
When? Soon. Very soon.
He pulled her close, his voice rough with emotion. I cannot leave you, but I cannot stay.
Then I'll come with you,
she said, the words spilling out before she'd even thought them through. He pulled back to look at her. Margaret, no. The life. It is hard. Always moving, always running. You do not know.
I know I'd rather face any hardship with you than live safely without you, she interrupted. I know that every day we've spent together has been worth more than all the years before.
I know that you are my home, not any town or building. My people may not accept you, he warned. You would be white woman among Apache, always different, always watched. I'm already always different, already always watched, she pointed out. At least with you, I'd be different with someone who understands, watched by someone who sees me truly. He was quiet for a long moment, holding her under the vast canopy of stars. When he spoke again, his voice was full of wonder. You would do this, leave everything.
What everything?
She asked. I have no family, no true friends, no home but a leaking shack. I wash clothes for people who despise me. You ask what I would leave nothing. You ask what I would gain everything. The journey will be dangerous. If soldiers catch us,
then we'll face it together.
She took his face in her hands, meeting his eyes. Nietzsche, I have been dead for 8 years. You brought me back to life. Don't ask me to go back to being dead. He kissed her then, their first kiss, under the stars in the land his people had roamed for generations. It was gentle and fierce at once, full of promise and pain, hope and fear. When they parted, both were breathless. 3 nights from now, he said, when moon is dark, meet me at the 3-Finger Rocks. Bring only what you can carry on your back. Wear clothes that will not show in darkness. I'll be there. If you change your mind, I understand. No shame in choosing safety. She kissed him again, quick and sure. I choose you. I choose life. I choose love. They parted then, knowing the next days would be the longest of their lives. Margaret returned to her shack and began preparing. She had so little that packing was easy. Her few clothes, her mother's Bible, the photograph of her parents. She traded her mother's wedding ring, the last valuable thing she owned, for sturdy boots and a canteen. She moved through her final days in Bitter Creek like a ghost, already gone in spirit. She watched the townspeople with their small concerns and smaller minds, and felt only pity. They would never know what she had learned, that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, that understanding could bridge any divide, that being truly alive was worth any risk. The night before she was to leave, Tom Garrett confronted her again. I know what you're doing, he said, his face twisted with anger and something else hurt, perhaps. Meeting that savage. People have seen things, signs. Then people should mind their own business, she said calmly. He'll kill you, Tom said desperately.
Or worse, you'll end up a squaw in some filthy camp, slave to—
Stop, she said firmly.
You know nothing about him or his people. Nothing about me. You see what you expect to see. What fear tells you to see.
And what do you see? He demanded. She thought of Naichi's gentle hands teaching her to identify healing plants, his laughter when she mispronounced Apache words, the pain in his eyes when he spoke of loss, the joy when he looked at her.
I see a man,
she said simply. A good man who makes me want to be alive. That's all. That's everything. She left Tom standing in the street, his face a mixture of incomprehension and rage. She felt sorry for him, trapped in his narrow world, but she couldn't save him. She could only save herself. The final sunset came, painting the desert in shades of fire. Margaret stood at her window one last time, looking out at the mountains that had called to her for so long. Tomorrow she would be among them, beginning a new life with the man who had taught her to love. She had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms, and now, preparing to leave everything she'd known for an uncertain future. She understood that love wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice, made again and again, to reach across divides, to see with clear eyes, to risk everything for the chance to truly live. And she chose Naichi, chose love, chose life, with every beat of her awakened heart. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after Margaret had joined Naichi's band. They had been traveling north through hidden valleys, a group of about 30 Apache men, women, and children. Margaret had been accepted with cautious curiosity rather than hostility, largely due to Naichi's standing among his people and the quiet dignity with which she conducted herself. She was learning to rise before the sun, to move silently through the camp, to contribute where she could. An elderly woman named Apache had taken her under her wing, teaching her with patient gestures and simple words. Margaret's hands were already raw from new work, preparing hides, gathering plants, tending fires, but her heart was full. Then came the thunder of hoofbeats, the crack of rifles, the screams. "Soldiers!" someone shouted in Apache, and the camp exploded into motion. Women grabbed children. Men reached for weapons. Naichi found Margaret in the chaos, pressing a knife into her hand. "Run for the canyon," he commanded. "Stay with Dakea. Go." But there was no time. The cavalry swept into the camp like a blue wave, rifles blazing. Margaret saw a young mother fall, still clutching her baby. An old man trying to defend his grandson was struck down, the air filled with gun smoke and dust and death. "No prisoners," she heard a soldier shout. "General's orders, no prisoners." Horror flooded through her. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. These soldiers weren't trying to capture or relocate. They were trying to exterminate. Naichi fought like a man possessed, trying to give the women and children time to escape. Margaret found herself swept along with a group running for the narrow canyon that offered the only escape route. Behind them, the shooting continued, punctuated by screams. They almost made it. The canyon mouth was just ahead when more soldiers appeared, cutting off their retreat. Margaret recognized the officer leading them, Lieutenant James Crawford, a man who'd often spoken in town about the Apache problem and his final solution to it. "Well, well," Crawford said, his eyes finding Margaret among the Apache. "The rumors were true. Margaret Shaw, living as a squaw." His smile was cruel. "What would your parents think?" Rage flooded through her, hot and pure. "They'd think I'd found more humanity among the Apache than I ever did in your civilized town." Crawford's face darkened. "Savage lover. You're worse than them. At least they were born to it." He raised his pistol, but not at her, at a child cowering nearby. A girl of perhaps 6 years. "No," Margaret moved without thinking, putting herself between the gun and the child. "She's done nothing. She's just a baby." "Nits make lice," Crawford said coldly, echoing the horrific philosophy she'd heard too often. "Stand aside or share their fate."
Then I'll share it, Margaret said, spreading her arms to shield as many children as she could. Because I'd rather die with honor than live with your kind of evil. For a moment, Crawford hesitated. Shooting Apache was one thing. The army expected it, even rewarded it. But shooting a white woman, even one who'd gone native, was another matter entirely. There would be questions, investigations. That hesitation saved them. Naichi and several warriors, having fought their way through the initial attack, struck the soldiers from behind. In the confusion, Margaret grabbed the children near her and ran for the canyon. Bullets whined past, striking rocks in bursts of dust and fragments. They ran through twisting passages, the sound of pursuit echoing behind them. Margaret's lungs burned. Her legs trembled, but she didn't stop. The child whose life she'd saved clung to her hand, running with the endurance her people learned young. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a place of relative safety, a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow crack in the rocks. Other survivors had gathered there, mostly women and children, a few wounded warriors. The full scale of the loss became clear as Margaret looked around. Of the 30 people who'd woken that morning, perhaps half remained. Naichi found her as darkness fell. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, not his own. She hoped. When he saw her, something broke in his controlled expression. He pulled her against him, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I thought I lost you," he said roughly. "When I saw Crawford's gun pointed at you, I couldn't let him shoot the children," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I couldn't just stand by." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "You have Apache heart," he said. "Brave, fierce, protective of innocent ones." His voice broke slightly. "My people see this. You are not white woman among Apache anymore. You are Apache with pale skin." Old Dakea approached, the child Margaret had saved holding her hand. The woman spoke at length in Apache, her weathered face serious. Naichi translated. "She says you stood between death and our children, says you chose to die rather than step aside. This is mark of true human being. She names you Guyen, wise woman warrior. It is honored name." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. To be accepted, even in the midst of such tragedy, was overwhelming. But the joy was overshadowed by grief. "All those people," she whispered. "Gone. Just gone." "This is our life," Naichi said heavily. "This is what I tried to protect you from. Soldiers come, we run, we fight, more die. Always fewer of us, always more of them." That night, as the survivors huddled in the hidden valley, Margaret truly understood what she had chosen. This wasn't a romantic adventure. This was survival at its most basic, its most brutal. The Apache lived with death as a constant companion, faced extinction with every dawn. But as she helped tend the wounded, as she held orphaned children while they cried, as she watched these people maintain dignity and compassion in the face of annihilation, she knew she'd made the right choice. They sang quietly for their dead, shared what little food they had, comforted each other. Even in their darkest hour, they were more alive than the townspeople had ever been. "Regret?" Naichi asked quietly, finding her staring at the stars. She thought of Crawford's cruel face, of the soldiers shooting fleeing children, of the civilization that sanctioned such slaughter. Then she thought of Dakea's acceptance, of the child sleeping in her lap, of the courage and grace of these hunted people. "No," she said firmly. "No regret, only sorrow for what was lost, and anger at the evil that caused it." "Anger is good," he said. "Anger keeps us fighting. But do not let it poison your heart. That is their way, not ours." She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "What happens now?" "We go deeper into mountains, find others of our people, try to survive another season." He was quiet for a moment. "Some speak of Mexico, cross-border, escape American soldiers. But Mexico has own soldiers, own hate. No place is safe for Apache. Then we make our stand where we can. Margaret said, "Together." He kissed her temple. Together, he agreed. As dawn approached, scouts returned with news. The soldiers had pulled back but were camped at the valley's main entrance. They knew survivors had escaped and were waiting for them to emerge. It was a siege, meant to starve them out. But the Apache knew this land in ways the soldiers never could. There were other ways out, dangerous paths through high passes. Known only to the people who'd used them for generations, it would mean abandoning the wounded who couldn't travel, leaving them hidden with what supplies could be spared, hoping to return for them later. Margaret helped prepare for the journey, her hands working alongside Apache hands, no longer separate but part of the whole. When they moved out in the pre-dawn darkness, she carried a child on her back, following in Naichi's footsteps through terrain that would have terrified her weeks ago. Behind them, smoke rose from their burning camp, a funeral pyre for those who'd fallen. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, constant danger. But Margaret felt no fear, only determination. She had found her people, her purpose, her place. The cost was high, higher than she'd imagined. But the alternative, a living death in Bitter Creek, a heart that never knew love, was unthinkable now. She had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms. Now she understood that love meant more than feeling. It meant choosing to stand with someone against the world if necessary. It meant finding courage you didn't know you had. It meant becoming who you were meant to be, no matter the cost. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the peaks in gold and rose, Margaret Shaw, now Guyen, wise woman warrior, climbed toward an uncertain future with her chosen people. And despite everything, her heart sang with the fierce joy of being truly, completely, defiantly alive. The mountains became their world. For weeks, they moved through terrain that would break most men's spirits, scaling cliff faces, fording icy streams, navigating paths where one false step meant death. Margaret's soft town life was a distant memory now. Her hands were hard with calluses, her body lean and strong, her senses sharp as any Apache's. They had joined with another band led by an elder chief named Victorio, swelling their numbers to perhaps 50 souls, still pitifully few against the hundreds of soldiers hunting them. But together they had a better chance. Margaret learned that survival meant constant vigilance, meant sleeping light with weapons close, meant being ready to run at any moment. But there were moments of peace too, stolen hours when the world seemed to forget they existed. In those times, Naichi taught her more of his people's ways, how to read stories in the stars, how to find medicine in common plants, how to pray in the Apache manner. She shared her own knowledge, teaching the children letters and numbers when they camped, telling stories from her mother's Bible that resonated with Apache values of courage and sacrifice. One night, as they sheltered in a box canyon with good water and grazing for the horses, Naichi took her aside. "The chiefs speak of you," he said. "They say you have proven yourself, say you should be made one of us in the old way." Margaret's heart leapt. "A ceremony?" "Yes, to make you truly Apache in the eyes of all, but," he hesitated, "it means cutting all ties to white world, no going back, ever." "I cut those ties the night I left Bitter Creek," she said firmly. "I want this. Naichi, I want to belong fully to your people, our people." The ceremony took place the next night, under a canopy of stars. Margaret stood before the gathered band, wearing a dress Dakia had made for her from soft deerskin. The chief spoke words she didn't fully understand, but felt in her bones. Sweet smoke from sacred herbs filled the air. When they marked her forehead with paint, she felt something shift inside her, the last walls between who she had been and who she had become crumbling away. Afterward, there was quiet celebration, not the raucous parties of white settlements, but something deeper, more meaningful. Stories were told, songs were sung, and Margaret was embraced fully as Guyen, sister and daughter and warrior woman of the Apache. That night, Naichi held her under their blankets, his voice soft with emotion. Now you are mine, and I am yours in the eyes of all. My wife, my heart, my life.
Always,
She whispered back.
in this world and the next.
But their joy was short-lived. 2 days later, scouts brought word that soldiers had found their trail. Not just any soldiers, Crawford's unit, reinforced with Apache scouts from rival bands who had surrendered to the government. These scouts could track as well as Nietzsche's people, knew the same hidden paths, the same water sources. We cannot outrun them forever, Victorio said gravely at the council. They have supplies, fresh horses, more men always coming. We grow fewer, weaker.
Then we fight, said a young warrior named Juanito. Die as Apache, not hunted animals.
And what of the children? Dakea asked sharply. They die as Apache, too better to live, even in captivity. Then let our bloodline end. The debate raged through the night. Some spoke for fighting to the last, others for trying to reach Mexico, still others for negotiating surrender. Margaret listened, understanding more Apache now, hearing the pain beneath every option. There were no good choices left, only degrees of loss. Finally, Nietzsche spoke. I say we split. Those who wish to surrender may go. No shame in choosing life for your children. Those who wish to keep fighting, we go deeper into mountains. Make them pay dear for every Apache life. It was decided. At dawn, the band would divide. About half, mostly families with young children, would head for Fort Buchanan to surrender. The rest would climb higher into the mountains, into country so rough even Apache found it challenging. That night, Margaret helped families prepare for separation, her heart breaking as she watched friends embrace for what might be the last time. Children were told to be brave. Couples who had faced everything together now faced different paths. It was a death of another kind, the death of a people's unity. You could go with them, Nietzsche said quietly as they watched the preparations. Crawford might be angry, but they wouldn't harm a white woman. You could say you were captive, that I forced you. Margaret turned to him, anger flashing in her eyes.
Don't insult me. I made my choice. I stand by it.
Even unto death.
Especially unto death.
She gripped his hands.
We live free or die free, together.
Dawn came gray and cold. The two groups faced each other for the last time. Warriors who had fought side by side now walked different roads. Dakea, choosing surrender for the sake of her grandchildren, embraced Margaret fiercely.
You have Apache heart,
the old woman said in her broken English.
Keep it strong. Keep our ways alive.
Then they were gone, walking toward captivity with heads high. Those who remained, 23 souls, turned toward the high peaks where winter already showed its teeth in snow-capped ridges. The journey that followed tested them to their limits. They climbed paths that mountain goats might refuse, crossed valleys where the air was so thin breathing became labor. Food grew scarce. Ammunition ran low. The horses, unable to manage the terrain, had to be released. They continued on foot, carrying what they could. But Crawford's soldiers, driven by hatred and the promise of promotion, wouldn't give up. Day after day, the pursuit continued. The Apache left false trails, set ambushes when they could, but always the soldiers came on. It became clear this was personal for Crawford. The white woman who had chosen Apache over her own kind was an insult he couldn't let stand. One night, huddled in a cave while snow fell outside, Nietzsche held Margaret close. Both were thin, exhausted, pushed beyond endurance, but neither spoke of giving up. I have been thinking, he said quietly. If something happens to me—
Nothing will happen,
she interrupted. Listen, he said gently. If I fall, you must try to live, find others of our people, keep our ways alive. Promise me. Only if you promise the same, she countered.
If I fall, you live, you fight. You remember that not all whites are evil, that love can bridge any divide.
You have taught me this, he admitted. Before you, I had only hate for whites. Now I know there can be understanding. It is gift you gave me. As you gave me the gift of life, she said. Real life, not just existence. They sealed their promises with a kiss. There in the cold cave with death hunting them. It was a moment of perfect understanding, perfect love, in the midst of perfect hardship. The end came 3 days later. They had reached a high plateau, thinking they had finally shaken the pursuit. But Crawford had circled around, using his scout's knowledge to cut them off. When the Apache crested the ridge, exhausted and strung out, soldiers were waiting. "Surrender," Crawford shouted through a megaphone. "You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Old Victorio, proud to the last, raised his rifle in answer. The plateau erupted in gunfire. Margaret found herself in the middle of the last battle of a dying people. Fighting not for victory. That was impossible, but for the right to die free. She saw Juanito fall, still trying to protect the few children left. Saw others she'd come to love cut down one by one. The snow turned red with blood. Through it all, Nietzsche fought like a man possessed, trying to shield others, trying to create a path to escape where none existed. Then she saw Crawford himself, advancing through the smoke, his pistol aimed at Nietzsche's back. Without thought, Margaret acted. She threw herself forward, pushing Nietzsche aside. The bullet meant for him struck her instead, spinning her around, dropping her into the blood-stained snow. "Margaret!" Nietzsche's cry was anguish given voice. He caught her as she fell, cradling her against him, even as bullets whined around them. "Live," she gasped, blood on her lips. "Promise, live." His face above her blurred. She heard continued gunfire, shouts, screams, but all that mattered was his eyes, his hands holding hers, his voice speaking her names, both Margaret and Guyen, like a prayer. She wanted to tell him so many things, that loving him had been worth everything, that she regretted nothing, that he had given her life in every way that mattered. But darkness was creeping in from the edges, and words were so hard. "I love you," she managed, in English, in Apache, in the language of the heart that needed no words. "And I love you," he said, his tears falling on her face. "Forever, in this world and the next." She smiled at that, remembering their promise. Then the darkness claimed her, but gently, like falling asleep in the arms of the one she loved most. She had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms. And, in the end, in his arms was where she died, having lived more truly in her brief time with him than most people did in a lifetime. She died Apache, died free, died loved, and somewhere in the swirling snow and gun smoke, her spirit danced with those who had gone before, finally and forever home. The gunfire seemed to last forever, echoing across the plateau like thunder. Nietzsche held Margaret's still form, his world reduced to her pale face and the spreading crimson in the snow. Around him, the last free Apache made their final stand, but he was beyond caring about anything but the woman in his arms. "Drop your weapons!" Crawford's voice cut through the chaos. "It's over." Slowly, the shooting died away. Nietzsche looked up to see they were surrounded, soldiers closing in from all sides. Of the 23 Apache who had climbed to this plateau, perhaps 6 still stood. Old Victoria was down, his sightless eyes staring at the sky he'd roamed beneath all his life. The children. Nietzsche couldn't bear to look for the children. Crawford approached, his pistol trained on Nietzsche. The lieutenant's face showed no satisfaction in victory, only cold determination. "Step away from her, savage." "No," Nietzsche said simply, tightening his hold on Margaret. "She's dead because of you." Crawford sneered. "Led astray by your heathen ways. She could have had a decent life, a proper Christian home." "She had life," Nietzsche interrupted, his voice fierce despite his grief. "With me. She lived. With you. She only existed. She chose. She chose every day to be with us, to be one of us. Crawford's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, another voice rang out. "Stand down, Lieutenant." A senior officer rode onto the plateau, his uniform marking him as a colonel. Behind him came more soldiers, including one Nietzsche recognized with dull surprise, Captain Foster from Fort Buchanan. The colonel dismounted, surveying the carnage with a grim expression. "Lieutenant Crawford, you were ordered to pursue and contain, not massacre. I see women and children among the dead." "Sir, they were all hostiles," Crawford protested. "And this man here, he corrupted a white woman, turned her against her own kind." "I've heard enough," the colonel interrupted. He looked at Margaret's body, then at Nietzsche. Something in the Apache's eyes, perhaps the depth of his grief, perhaps the protective way he held her even in death, seemed to affect him. "Captain Foster, what do you know of this woman?" Foster dismounted slowly. "Margaret Shaw, sir, orphaned on the wagon trails. Worked in Bitter Creek until she left to join the Apache. The townspeople said she was bewitched, but—" He paused, looking at the scene. "I knew her briefly, sir. She was sound of mind. Whatever choice she made it freely." The colonel was quiet for a long moment. Then he noticed something, papers scattered near Victorio's body, blown by the wind. "Gather those," he ordered. A soldier collected the papers, bringing them to the colonel. As he read, his expression changed. "These are treaties," he said slowly. "Peace proposals, terms for surrender that would have allowed them to stay on a portion of their ancestral lands." He looked at Crawford with cold eyes. "Did you know they were trying to negotiate, Lieutenant?" Crawford's silence was answer enough. "Sir," Captain Foster spoke up, "if I may, there's something else." He pulled out a leather journal. "This was found at one of the abandoned Apache camps. It belonged to Miss Shaw. Perhaps you should read it." The colonel took the journal, flipping through pages covered in Margaret's neat handwriting. As he read, his expression grew more thoughtful. These were not the ravings of a bewitched woman, but eloquent observations about Apache life, their struggles, their humanity. Love letters to Nietzsche never sent, descriptions of children learning their letters, of old women sharing their wisdom, of a people trying to survive against impossible odds. "My God," the colonel murmured. He read aloud one passage. "They call them savage, but I have found more civilization in their care for one another than in all the drawing rooms of Bitter Creek. They share when they have little, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and face death with a dignity that shames our Christian soldiers who come to kill babies in the name of progress." An uncomfortable silence fell over the plateau. Even some of Crawford's men looked shaken. The colonel closed the journal and looked at Nietzsche. "You loved her." It wasn't a question, but Nietzsche answered anyway. "More than my life. She was my heart walking outside my body." "And she loved you." "She said so, with her last breath." The colonel was silent, then made a decision that would be debated in military records for years to come. "Sergeant, bring medical supplies. See if any of the wounded can be saved." "Sir," Crawford protested. "They're hostiles." "They're human beings, Lieutenant, and you're relieved of command, pending investigation into your conduct. Specifically, your apparent suppression of peace negotiations and excessive force against non-combatants." As soldiers moved to tend the few Apache wounded, the colonel approached Nietzsche again. "I cannot undo what has been done. Your people, there are so few left, but I can offer this safe passage to the reservation for any who survive. And—" He hesitated, then continued, "permission to bury your dead according to your customs." Nietzsche looked at him with hollow eyes. "And her Margaret Guyen. She died as she lived, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither and yet transcending both." The colonel's voice was thoughtful. "But from what I've read, I believe she would want to rest with the people she chose. bury her as Apache. The next hours passed in a blur of grief and grim necessity. The surviving Apache, only 5 besides Naichi, prepared their dead with what ceremony they could manage. Crawford, under guard now, watched with impotent rage as Margaret was wrapped in a blanket alongside the Apache fallen. No distinction made between white woman and Apache warrior. As the sun began to set, Naichi carried Margaret to a sheltered grove of pines overlooking the valley. The other survivors helped him prepare her resting place, according to the old ways. They sang the death songs quietly, their voices carrying sorrow and celebration in equal measure. Sorrow for the loss, celebration for a life well lived. Captain Foster approached as Naichi finished the burial rites. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly. "I'll make sure her story is told truly. Not Crawford's version, but the truth. That she chose love over safety, understanding over prejudice." Naichi nodded, unable to speak. He knelt by her grave one last time, his hand on the freshly turned earth. In Apache, he whispered promises, that he would live as she asked, that he would remember always that bridges could be built between peoples, that love could bloom even in hatred's shadow. When he rose, the surviving Apache were waiting. Broken, defeated, but still standing. Still Apache. Together, they began the long walk toward an uncertain future on the reservation. It was surrender. Yes, but it was also survival. Margaret would have understood. She had taught them that sometimes living required more courage than dying. As they walked away from the killing ground, Naichi carried Margaret's journal, given to him by the colonel. In its pages lived her voice, her thoughts, her love. He would keep it always, a reminder of the woman who had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms. The story should have ended there, in tragedy and loss. But stories, like lives, sometimes have unexpected codas. Years later, on the reservation, Naichi became a bridge between worlds, teaching white officials about Apache ways, helping his people navigate the strange new reality of reservation life. He never remarried, but he helped raise the orphaned children, teaching them English alongside Apache, preparing them for a world where they would need both. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would tell the story of Guyen, the wise woman warrior with pale skin and an Apache heart, how she chose love over fear, chose understanding over ignorance, chose to live fully even when it meant dying young. The children would listen with wide eyes, and in their hearts, a seed would be planted, the knowledge that love could bloom anywhere. That courage came in many forms, that being different was not a curse but a gift. In the end, Margaret's gravestone bore no name, no dates, no Christian inscription, but Naichi had marked it in the Apache way, with symbols that told her story for those who knew how to read them. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the high meadows, they seemed to grow especially beautiful around that sheltered grove, as if the earth itself remembered the woman who had bridged 2 worlds with nothing but an open heart and indomitable spirit. She had never loved any man, until the Apache pulled her into his arms, and in choosing that love, in living and dying for it, she became legend. Not the false legends of dime novels and Wild West shows, but the true legend of a love that transcended all boundaries, a courage that faced down armies, and a choice that echoed through generations. In the vast sweep of history, she was just one woman, one story among thousands, but for those who knew her, who remembered her, who carried her story forward, she was proof that in the darkest of times, in the face of the greatest hatred, love could still bloom like wildflowers in the desert, unexpected, resilient, and absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the Wild West. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Naichi's story in the comments below. Did their love touch your heart as it touched mine?
Let's discuss this powerful tale of love that conquered all boundaries.